The waves of the Atlantic crashed violently against the sides of the British fleet as they sailed toward an engagement that would decide the fate of empires. It was October 21st, 1805, and Admiral Horatio Nelson, aboard his flagship HMS Victory, knew that this day would be one for the history books. The Franco-Spanish fleet, under the combined command of Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve and Admiral Federico Gravina, sought to break the British naval blockade and challenge their dominance at sea. Yet Nelson, one of Britain's greatest naval heroes, had other plans. He understood that the future of Britain, perhaps even Europe, hung in the balance. And as the two great fleets closed in, Nelson had no intention of letting his enemies escape the net he had meticulously cast. Nelson's audacity and tactical brilliance had brought the British Navy to this decisive moment. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, and Napoleon Bonaparte, with his ambition of dominating the continent, needed to weaken Britain's naval supremacy to ensure his invasion plans for England could succeed. For Napoleon, controlling the seas was the only way to secure his conquests and spread his empire across the English Channel. But for Britain, the navy was not just a tool of war. It was the lifeline of the island nation. Whoever ruled the waves would dictate the future, and Nelson was fully aware of the gravity of the battle that was about to unfold. The Battle of Trafalgar would become one of the most celebrated naval victories in British history, a moment that secured British naval dominance for over a century. But the road to Trafalgar was not paved with certainty. In the years leading up to the battle, the French navy, bolstered by Spain, had been preparing for a decisive confrontation. Napoleon, frustrated by the stalemate on the seas, pressured Villeneuve to break the British blockade, rendezvous with the Spanish fleet, and together they would challenge the Royal Navy's control of the oceans. Yet Villeneuve, lacking the confidence of his emperor and hesitant to face Nelson's fleet, had spent months delaying his actions. By late October 1805, Villeneuve had no choice. Ordered by Napoleon to break out of the port of Cadiz, Villeneuve led his fleet into the Atlantic, hoping to evade the British or at least catch them unprepared. But Nelson, ever vigilant, had been tracking their movements. As the French and Spanish forces emerged from port, they were met with a sight that must have filled them with dread. The British fleet, battle-ready and poised for action. Nelson's tactics were unconventional for the time. Traditional naval engagements saw fleets forming long lines, ships exchanging broadsides in parallel formation. But Nelson, with his aggressive nature and deep understanding of naval warfare, had something different in mind. He split his fleet into two columns, intending to break through the Franco-Spanish lines at two critical points. By doing so, he aimed to split the enemy fleet, disrupt their communication, and cause chaos among their ranks. It was a bold and dangerous maneuver, one that would expose his ships to devastating fire as they approached the enemy. But Nelson had faith in the discipline and skill of his sailors. As the two fleets closed in, the tension on board the ships was palpable. Nelson, ever the inspirational leader, famously signalled to his fleet, "England expects that every man will do his duty." These words would be remembered for generations, a rallying cry for the men who were about to face the full fury of battle. Around noon, the first shots were fired. The British fleet, led by Victory and HMS Royal Sovereign, began their charge toward the enemy lines. The French and Spanish ships, arrayed in a defensive crescent, opened fire with all their might. Cannonballs ripped through the air, splintering wood and sending debris flying across the decks. As Nelson's flagship Victory charged toward the French Bucentaure, Villeneuve's own flagship, the enemy fire grew heavier and more accurate. Yet Nelson pressed on, determined to execute his daring plan. When Victory finally broke through the Franco-Spanish line, it unleashed a devastating broadside into Bucentaure, smashing through her decks and causing chaos among her crew. The shock and awe of the British attack were felt across the enemy fleet. Admiral Villeneuve, trapped aboard his ship, was powerless to prevent the devastation unfolding around him. Nelson's tactics had worked perfectly. By splitting the enemy line, he had thrown their formations into disarray, allowing the British ships to engage individual enemy vessels at close quarters. The battle quickly devolved into brutal, chaotic fighting. Ships collided, cannons roared, and men fought hand-to-hand on the decks of their vessels. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of cannon fire, splintering wood, and the shouts of sailors desperately trying to maintain control amid the carnage. The sea around the battle was thick with smoke, turning day into night as the ships traded broadsides at point-blank range. British ships, well-drilled and disciplined, fired with lethal accuracy, shredding the sails and rigging of the Franco-Spanish fleet. As the battle raged on, Nelson remained at the helm of victory, directing the engagement with the calm demeanour of a seasoned commander. But fate had a cruel twist in store for Britain's hero. At the height of the battle, a French sharpshooter, perched in the rigging of the Redoutable, one of the French ships engaged in close combat with Victory, took aim at Nelson. The shot found its mark, striking Nelson in the shoulder and passing through his spine. Gravely wounded, Nelson was carried below deck, but even as his life ebbed away, he continued to ask for updates on the progress of the battle. Despite his injury, Nelson's tactics had turned the tide of the engagement. The British ships, led by the relentless Victory and Royal Sovereign, had broken the back of the Franco-Spanish fleet. One by one, enemy ships began to strike their colours, signalling their surrender. The French Bucentaure, Redoutable, and the Spanish Santa Ana were among the many ships that fell to British cannon fire. Admiral Villeneuve, defeated and humiliated, was captured aboard his flagship. The battle, though fierce and bloody, was decisively won by the British. But the victory came at a great cost. As the battle drew to a close, Nelson succumbed to his injuries. His final words, "Thank God I have done my duty," echoed through the decks of Victory. The men aboard the ship, and indeed across the entire British fleet, mourned the loss of their beloved admiral. Nelson had paid the ultimate price for his victory, but he had ensured that Britain's control of the seas would remain unchallenged. The Battle of Trafalgar was a decisive and crushing victory for the British. Of the 33 ships in the Franco-Spanish fleet, 22 were either captured or destroyed, while the British lost no ships. The scale of the defeat sent shockwaves through Europe. Napoleon's plans for an invasion of England were shattered, and the French and Spanish navies, once formidable forces, would never again challenge Britain's supremacy at sea. In the aftermath of the battle, Britain emerged as the dominant naval power of the 19th century, a position it would hold for over a century. Trafalgar became a symbol of British strength and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the discipline and determination of the Royal Navy would prevail. Nelson, though lost to the nation, became an immortal hero, celebrated in monuments, songs and stories for generations to come. The Franco-Spanish alliance was left in tatters. Villeneuve, captured and disgraced, was taken to Britain as a prisoner of war. His failure to break the British blockade and his defeat at Trafalgar earned him the scorn of Napoleon, who would never forgive him for losing the battle that could have secured French dominance in Europe. Spain, too, was left weakened by the loss of so many ships and sailors, further destabilizing its already fragile empire. For Napoleon, the defeat at Trafalgar was a bitter pill to swallow. Though his armies continued to win victories on land, the loss of his naval power meant that his dreams of conquering Britain were forever dashed. The seas would remain firmly in British hands, and as long as the Royal Navy controlled the oceans, Napoleon's empire would always be vulnerable. The Battle of Trafalgar was more than just a naval engagement. It was a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars and in world history. It ensured that Britain would remain safe from invasion, and it secured the nation's position as the world's foremost naval power. Nelson's legacy, forged in the fires of battle and sealed with his ultimate sacrifice, would live on for centuries, inspiring generations of sailors and soldiers alike. As the smoke cleared over the waters of Trafalgar, it was clear that the balance of power in Europe had shifted. The British, though few in number, had proven that skill, discipline and leadership could overcome even the mightiest of foes. The French and Spanish fleets, once proud and powerful, had been humbled by the relentless might of the Royal Navy, and Nelson, though gone, had ensured that his beloved England would remain free and unconquered. Trafalgar was a victory of strategy, courage, and sacrifice, a battle that would forever be remembered as the moment when the fate of Europe was decided on the rolling waves of the Atlantic.